Why are so many people in the media, including Jimmy Kimmel, talking about sex in space? We have a talk with Dr. Alex Layendecker today. Stick around. So, Alex, you have been pretty busy lately with all of the efforts that you are endeavoring on with regard to sex and zero gravity environments and the implications of that. And well, let's get to the most recent thing first. Now, a green paper was just published that actually got the attention of Jimmy Kimmel.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for watching at home and joining us on. It's a beautiful day here in Southern California on the planet Earth. I'll tell you something. I will never leave the planet Earth. A lot of people want to go into space. I do not. Would you ever go into space, Guillermo?
No, Jimmy, no.
No. But for those who do, and a lot of people do, a team of scientists from all over the world is making a case that as space tourism continues to grow, people will naturally start having sex in space, like Captain Kirk. And we have to start preparing for this. These findings are part of a research paper called Consideration of Uncontrolled Human Conception in Emerging Space Tourism. Hot title, right? I mean, getting a little sexed up just saying it, I have to admit. It has 9 authors, this title. 9 very lonely authors worked on this together. And all these people believe we could be buzzing our aldrins together sometime in the next decade. The next decade, I checked today, there are 7 people on the International Space Station right now. They've been on this space station for months. If space sex hasn't happened already, it might happen tonight. It's about to happen. I'd imagine that sex in space is very like, how do you even tell who's on top?
Tell me a little bit about this green paper and why it's getting so much attention, and what are the implications behind its publication?
Okay, so the paper actually had been conceived of going back several years by its lead author, Professor Dave Cullen. He's with Cranfield University. He's the professor of astrobiology and space biotechnology out at Cranfield in the UK. And he has been a longtime advisor for Spaceborne United Incorporated, based over in the Netherlands, who I have consulted for, and been on their advisory board with him for going back years now, I think all the way to around about 2018, 2019.
And what is Spaceborne? Let's address that real quick.
Oh, I'm not sure if we talked a bit about this in our last podcast together. So Spaceborne came about in 2018, almost out of thin air. At the time, the name of the company was Space Life Origin. When they, made their press release to the world saying, we are a, brand new biotech company, and we plan on birthing the first human baby in space by 2024. So obviously very ambitious timeline.
Yeah. They got like what, a year now?
Yeah. And I was at, when I heard about them for the first time, I was actually at, I want to say it was the New World's 2018 conference in Austin. And my phone starts blowing up from folks in the community, in the, commercial space community, saying, hey, have you heard about this? I figured you would be the person to ask. Who are these guys? What are their thing? And I looked them up and saw their website and said, you know what? I have absolutely no idea, but some of what is being said here is, as I said, somewhat ambitious from a medical, or just medically ethical perspective.
Sure.
So I reached out to who at the time was their COO and is now the CEO of Spaceborne. So the company went through some restructuring. There was I think a little bit of fallout between the leaders in the company, but the founder of the company, who was the COO at the time and is now the CEO of Spaceborne, newly rebranded under Spaceborne the last few years. He and I had a very good conversation, and I told him, I said, hey, I'm about to go on stage in an hour or two to discuss this very topic, and I just want to give you a heads up. Hey, this is me. This is who I am, and based on the research that I've done in the past, what you're suggesting is probably not terribly feasible, because there's a whole bunch of uncharted, medical and ethical guidelines that things that haven't even been really written yet, and you're effectively walking into a minefield, is what I told them. So they,
I hope he took that well.
he
It
did.
sounds like
He did.
good. You were working together.
Great guy. He's a scientist, so he looked at kind of looked at the new information that I had given him, and went back and talked with his still partners at the time, and they effectively restructured the entire company's outlook and business plan based on sort of what I had told them, at least in terms of going away from live birth in that quick of a timeline, given that there are so many unknowns that just present so many hazards to an unborn child or a developing fetus. So from that point forward, developed a good relationship with Spaceborne. I've been on their advisory board these last few years. We collaborate, or we try to collaborate as much as we can, and keep each other informed on developments within our sort of research timelines, and just in general as to what's going on in the commercial space community and biotechnology in this particular area.
Right.
So that is sort of the relationship that I've had with Spaceborne over the last few years. One of their other advisors, as I mentioned, Dr. Dave Cullen, out there in the UK, was the lead for helping them develop the technology for what is known as the Artist missions. So Artist 1 is projected right now to go up sometime in 2024, and we're hopefully looking at getting a test launch knocked out sometime later this year, hopefully out of Iceland. That'll just be
Artist 1.
Artist 1. So Artist stands for Assisted Reproductive Technology in Space. So there has been a capsule that has been developed that does IVF. It's effectively a small IVF lab, does IVF biotechnology in a capsule that is all automated, all roboticized. And it is only about, I want to say, maybe even a meter wide. So I actually presented, we're still in April, right? So mid-March,
till tomorrow.
last month, mid-March, I actually got the opportunity to moderate a panel on this very topic at South by Southwest in Austin. We can talk more about that later if you'd like. And we brought a model, so just the empty shell of the spacecraft, out onto the stage for folks to see. So it's really only about a meter wide. It can go up in a relatively small rocket, and once it's on orbit, it's designed to be on orbit for varying periods. But as the Artist missions progress, it'll go from being up exposed in that environment for a very short time to somewhat longer times, and we'll see how that affects certain elements of fertilization and survivability of the embryos. So Dave Cullen, who is the lead in developing that biotech, or was one of the leaders in developing that biotech, came to the Spaceborne United group of associate scientists, a few years ago, and stated something to the effect of, "Hey, has anybody considered space tourism and the dangers that might be involved with when space tourists finally start going up in mass?" And we're not talking about professionally trained NASA astronauts or any other agency, or privately trained, but still to a professional level, commercial astronauts, as opposed to folks that have been training and preparing this sort of for their entire lives. Now you have folks that really just want to take a 2-week sort of honeymoon to the literal moon, and go and float in a capsule, maybe a space hotel, which has definitely been floated by multiple folks as a business idea. for going back decades, but now we're getting closer to that actually coming to fruition. Costs of launch are coming down big time. We just had the first major Starship test launch, and yes, it did blow up in the end. But the launch itself,
yeah, that was all over
the
the
launch
news.
itself was primarily viewed as a success by SpaceX, and from public official, from.
Now, what differentiated that rocket from, say, others that have been tested
So
successfully launched?
So to this point, my understanding of the SpaceX progression model is that, so they started off with the Falcon 1, which was a relatively very small rocket. Actually, I was at the Air Force Academy when they launched, I believe when they launched their first one. And I remember it very specifically because the astronautics department or the astroengineering department at the Academy actually had designed and built a small payload to go on that rocket, and they were effectively putting it on the rocket for free, because it's a test launch. So you provide a payload. You're not really, I don't think you're really normally paying anything, but it's a test launch, so who knows if your payload's going to survive, because the rocket could very easily have an anomaly, blow up,
right?
Or just fail to secure the proper orbit for your payload. So that rocket ended up blowing up. I remember that very distinctly because there were some pretty upset people in our astronautics faculty. So following that, SpaceX went on. They developed a line of rockets, more or less, and so you had the hey, Falcon 1 went to Falcon 9. Falcon 9 actually has had a very pretty successful track record. Did not early on. They lost the first few, and I think they were basically on the verge of effectively having to shut down or go bankrupt if their fourth, I think it was the fourth launch, if their fourth launch did not work out. And I forget what year this was. It may have been 2009. I'll go with that for now, but don't don't quote me on that. I'll have to go look that information up and refresh myself. So this launch went off and it was successful, and from that point forward they managed to keep having successes, and eventually got to the point where they could reuse the rockets, bring them back and land them on the pad. That was its own whole sort of test progression series, where you had a lot of rockets coming back and blowing up, striking close to the pad but not striking at the right angle, things like that.
No, I think just to interrupt for a second, I think a lot of the viewers might wonder why the landing pads are on the ocean and not on land.
Well, they're both actually. So a lot of the tech that has been tested was done using land-based pads. Land is a lot more stable. It is much tougher to stably land a rocket, coming from
and on waves,
top of the atmosphere. It's much easier to land it on a stable ground platform as opposed to something that's rocking in the ocean, that could potentially also be moving around a bit, because it's a boat, it's a ship.
Right.
So I actually got to witness some rocket recoveries in person after they had sort of already perfected the process. So it was one of the coolest things I've actually ever seen in my life. I saw on a Falcon Heavy, which was the next progression after the Falcon 9. It was effectively a Falcon Heavy is effectively, I guess, 3 Falcon 9s strapped together, and then at least at the booster core level.
Right.
And that is obviously much more thrust force. It can bring heavier payloads further. This was all done working up to I don't want to give an extended history of SpaceX here, but this series of rockets was all designed, constructed in building up to what eventually would become Starship, which uses Raptor engines. I forget the exact number. So they used to call it BFR for Big Effing Rocket. But then it I guess that kind of got changed to Big Falcon rocket, but
Yeah.
so that is the name of the booster, the rocket itself, and then Starship goes on top, is the spaceship that goes on top of it.
Yep.
And I apologize to anybody from SpaceX who may be listening if I've given any inaccuracies. Just type it in the comments
Okay.
to correct me. So
So that's led up to the launch that just recently happened that blew up.
yeah, so just recently, and obviously there was no people or really even, I don't think, even payload on board, but it was, every test launch is supposed to be, hey, proof of concept, and anomalies do happen. It's
Sure.
not uncommon. It was not uncommon back when the US was starting up the space program.
Right.
So getting those parts right so that we can have a safe system later is, that's what test launches are for. This launch was viewed overall by SpaceX, I believe, as a success, because it got off the pad, and I need to, I don't know that they've released the full after action report yet, and if they had, I have not read it. So I just know that there was an anomaly at some point, and the thing blew up and came back down, and I think SpaceX referred to it as a unscheduled rapid disassembly.
Yeah, I love technobabble.
So they had some good humor about it. And every launch is a learning experience, right? So now we are finally getting the point where I think probably we might see within the next 6 months to a year, their next launch, to test the next phase. They're going to take the mistakes and the lessons from this one and roll it into the next rocket, and then hopefully that one will make good orbit. Start the Starship test model will go around the Earth a few times, or whatever they want to establish for that mission set, and then come back down. So
Now,
once
is this
they
related to the artist endeavors?
No, so we use a different platform right now. So there are multiple launch. I actually don't know that I'm allowed to speak on who we are partnered with currently, and especially since we're sort of in the test launch phase. But yeah, so we are partnered with a commercial rocket company, and when I say we, the royal we of Spaceborne. So
And
they
this is what's going to be
they
taking place
Spaceborne are.
in Iceland.
Sorry, go ahead.
This is what's going to be taking place in Iceland at some point.
That is what is projected for sometime later this year. We sort of expect that the test launch will be happening out of Iceland, which is a really, really neat place to go anyway. So yeah, looking at where we sit now with commercial space and the possibilities and the potentials going forward, you've got things like the Dear Moon project, which is going to be a Starship mission, is going to take a oh man, his name is escaping me, but he's a Japanese billionaire who bought a mission back in, I want to say, 2018, and he's taking 8 artists with him. I believe Steve Aoki, the DJ, is one of the artists. And then there's a number of folks that are well established in their fields, but I think the premise of the project is they're going to fly around the moon, and each of these crew members, these effectively space tourists, are going to create a piece of art about the experience and share that with the rest of humanity. So it's a really cool concept, and I don't know the cost of a Starship and a BFR at this point, but I imagine it's pretty expensive.
Yeah, you have to be a billionaire to afford it.
one of the most expensive art projects in history, but
yeah.
it's sort of the if you've heard of the overview effect, sort of getting to help bestow some of that on the rest of humanity, and continue driving inspiration and continue sort of reaching for the stars. You know,
Yeah, I have heard of the overview effect, and actually, when William Shatner went up, that was something that was profoundly impactful for him, and he's talked about that repeatedly since then.
Yeah, and I actually,
and for him, it was a tragedy. You know, some people have had, some astronauts, I think, have commented that it gave them a new appreciation for the planet and its you know, isolation within the universe. I think William Shatner had almost a depressive reaction to it because he realized how destructive we are to the only planet that we have.
And that was sort of what I picked up too. So I actually saw him speak at South by Southwest. He was one of the keynote speakers, and he spoke the day after we did our presentation. So his was the one talk that I said, I gotta go see this.
Yeah. You know, I think just did an episode on the Origins Project like just a couple days ago.
Oh, cool. Okay, so he was, I mean, just an incredible speaker. His, you know, a very, in a way, still sort of very theatrical, but in a not in a way that not in a way that you don't like. I mean, it was very endearing.
No, I watched the most recent episode from the Origins Project Foundation with him, and he's big. He's very grand in his perceptions, but it's also very, like you said, endearing for sure.
Yeah. And I remember him speaking. So, you know, I'm gonna butcher this, but I remember him speaking and saying, when I looked out into space, all I could see was blackness and death. I couldn't see any stars. It was just black. And then I looked back and I saw the, you know, the smear of blue and the white and the brown. And there, among all the death and all the blackness, was life. And he said that when he came down, he didn't realize right away, but he realized after he came down, what he was experiencing was actually sort of this deep melancholy feeling, this depression, for the reason, you know, kind of for the reasons you stated, that we're destroying everything.
Yeah.
And
no, he tried speaking to it when he had come down with Bezos, and Bezos was more preoccupied and I actually had a very visceral reaction to Bezos' reaction to Shatner attempting to sort of describe, because I asked Shatner to describe this experience as they landed, or once they had landed, and he started to, and then Bezos was handed like this champagne bottle and shook it.
Oh,
and
I remember that.
Started going into this party and I'm just like, I had this really visceral negative reaction to how Bezos handled that, and I was really glad to, you know, Shatner spoke on it later, and it was very meaningful. So I would imagine that he was still in that headspace when you saw him.
Yeah, and seeing him, that was one of those speeches, seeing it in person, that I think I'll sort of always remember. But
well, that's interesting how that might affect artists.
Yeah, and actually, so I was at a conference just 2 days ago in Los Angeles that I was running a side panel workshop at, based on the green paper, and Frank White, the author of the Overview Effect, actually also spoke. So saw him and his conversation. I think Sharon Hagel, who's a Blue Origin astronaut. And actually, she was part of the first commercial crew married couple that has gone up in space. So her and her husband. I forget, man, I'm trying to remember how recent that was. But yeah, I mean, these are all things that we can kind of look up and put in the notes afterwards.
Sure.
But yeah, so
like
in a very yeah, in a very stretched out roundabout way to bring this all back to what the original question was.
Right.
I know. I tend to go off on these, you know, side tangents of side.
Well, yeah. There's a lot to cover. I mean, sex and space is a big topic.
And we've hardly talked about it.
I know. We could literally talk for like half a day.
Commercial space, yeah. Mostly just been talking about commercial space up to this point. But because of what commercial space is now doing and the opportunities it's presenting with everyday ordinary people who are able to afford a ticket or win a ticket in some kind of lottery or something like that,
Sure.
as some part of some project or sort of public venture. They are now going to have the opportunity to go up and be in those environments. And something that, when we released the paper, something that I said is you're seeing this shift from professionally trained astronauts, whether they be government or commercial, to regular people. And so your motivations are going to be different. Your behaviors are going to be different. Your levels of self-restraint are going to be
Yeah.
are going to be different. And these are all things, from a sociological point of view, we need to take into consideration.
Yeah, especially because of potential consequences,
Yes, because
which carry huge ethical implications.
yeah, well, certainly when it comes to things like conception and potential pregnancy, because if folks are able to go up for, say, 2 weeks at a time, you've got the early stages of conception, fertilization, implantation. They're early stages of the first trimester of pregnancy.
Yep.
That sort of
we
all
know that there
happen.
can be consequences to that on Earth. The
Yes,
ingestion of
yeah.
certain
Well,
chemicals
and
or the
space
environment or
space
whatever.
presents much bigger challenges.
Right.
It's already, there's already potential pitfalls when everything in the environment is right. When everything in the environment is wrong,
Yeah.
high radiation levels, microgravity levels, which feels like there's really no such thing as 0G per se,
Right.
because gravity exerts, from anywhere there's mass. But
Yep.
what is effectively free fall, and gravity isn't affecting the body at the same level,
Right.
you're going to have potential complications with those early stages of potentially embryogenesis, gamete release, travel of a fertilized zygote. That is one of the most worrisome ones that I can think of. Is, let's say that
So
you're in
there's
a
risk for a tubal pregnancy?
yeah, no, absolutely, risks of ectopic pregnancy.
Yeah.
So if a fertilized zygote cannot make its way down through the fallopian tube and into the uterus and implant it in the uterine wall, and it just wanders around and sort of gets stuck in the fallopian tube, then yes, you have risks of ectopic pregnancy. And depending how long the mother is up there, I mean, it's not just a risk to the life of the baby, it's a risk to the life of the mother.
Yeah, of course. And that's a conversation that's being had right now with the abortion debate and so forth, is ectopic pregnancies and the high risk of fatality that they bring.
Yeah.
So now you're up in space. What do you do there?
Well, and I think that the risks to pregnancy that come with space environments, I think in the future you could see the same level of sort of emotion and political divide that you see around abortion these days on Earth. I mean, you could potentially see just as sort of vitriolic a conversation when it comes to babies in space.
Well,
and
I
there
would
are
imagine that same conversation is possible with this potential launch of this automated IVF pod.
So well, I can't really and won't really speak to that too much. I don't want to speak as a representative of Spaceborne. I act as an advisor to them as well as I can in whatever manner I can.
Sure.
But they do have some just absolutely world-class IVF doctors. Their chief medical officer, Dr. Sheila Ali, is very prominent in their field. So IVF, they know well, and their CEO, Dr. Edelbrock, is actually an IVF donor. So he's been sort of in and around that world for a very long time, and has had many discussions around the ethics and the medical consultation sort of areas around it. So will there be some controversy? There is potential for that, but I would defer that to the Spaceborne's sort of public affairs team.
Sure.
With this
For me, it
paper,
was more, I can imagine that given especially the political environment here in the United States anyway, that is going to be a topic of conversation politically.
yeah,
Any of this
yeah,
really.
I definitely could see it becoming political. In
Hopefully.
fact, there's a lot of resistance against studying, sex and space at all that has typically been politically based, more from, sort of your conservative religious
Well, and
viewpoint.
actually,
You
that's
want your
something that,
taxpayer dollars
yeah,
paying for,
that's something
paying
you
for
and I
sex
have
research
talked
and stuff.
about, and that's something that we talk about at the museum when people come in and they see the exhibit that that you created there about this topic. When they ask our docents, what about this, and what's the, what's going on with this, and we say, well, historically, people who have tried to study this have been silenced or removed from their positions, and I don't know that that's really changed all that much. I mean,
So
it
at
seems
least,
like maybe it's going in a different direction, but that direction is taking its time getting there.
yes, it's certainly not going kind of fast enough on the government agency level. To my knowledge, NASA's sort of unofficial policy is still, we don't look at that, and we don't, we're not researching that right now. We're more focused on, and I actually said this at South by Southwest. NASA has always sort of been more oriented as an engineering organization. They're about engineering vehicles. They're about engineering our way to get there. They've always put probably, I would say, less emphasis on space life sciences and astronaut biology. Yes, it's important because, hey, we got to
We're
design
sending live people up there.
life support systems. We got to keep the astronauts healthy and things like that.
Right.
But they have sort of, despite NASA I believe in recent years, NASA's budget has actually slowly been increasing, which is always that's a positive thing to me.
Yeah.
But there have certainly been periods where the space life sciences budget has decreased, and they've put less emphasis on such things, and they sort of put they've sort of used band-aids for physiological issues, such as, fully grown, functioning, trained professional astronauts go up there in pretty good health, and you still see, because of microgravity and the compounding effects of that synergistically with radiation,
Right.
you still see things like 20% bone mass loss in certain areas of the body. You see weakening of the heart because the heart doesn't have to pump as hard. And NASA's answer to that has sort of traditionally always been to build a couple hours each day into the schedule for the astronauts to exercise, using resistance bands and things like that, which helps a little bit, but it's more of a band-aid. We evolved in 1 Earth G gravity well,
Right.
and to suddenly and radically change that, it just has profound effects on all our physiological systems.
So now, actually, that's a really good place to segue into ASRI. Now, you've pretty well with this green paper, ASRI's been publicly acknowledged, although I don't think you've done any kind of a press release around ASRI officially. But what you're talking about is, these life sciences is the focus of ASRI, especially as it pertains to reproduction. So for those that are watching, what is ASRI and what's the mission of ASRI?
Okay, so before I launch into that, last thing I would like to say about the green paper, we've spent the last 20 minutes me sort of working toward it.
Sure.
So this paper was designed conceptually to ask those questions about, hey, are there risks to, there are sort of unknown unknowns, right, surrounding conception in space, and is it, what are the liabilities? Was kind of one of the key premises of the papers. Is the space tourism industry, the developing space tourism industry and the commercial space industry, are they sort of walking into a liability minefield?
Right.
Because they're not properly informing folks. It's important to have informed consent if you're ever going to put yourself in any kind of hazardous situation. But one of the things that the paper explores is the fact that a let's say that a couple does get pregnant in space and they want, this is something that they actually wanted to do, or, because they want to be the first to conceive in space. But there are developmental issues with the fetus down the line. The baby that is born at a later time did not have informed consent at the time. You can't really give informed consent to a baby, and they don't really have any and they don't really have any say, which is why it kind of comes back to, I think this will be sort of in parallel to the arguments that are made back and forth on abortion all the time. I think it'll be somewhat similar. The paper kind of explores that, and it effectively wants to act as or the intent was for the paper to act as sort of sounding not quite an alarm, but raising the issues so that people start paying attention to them, especially as we start marching forward, because we are right on the cusp of of said activities happening. Because I guarantee you, people go up to a space hotel, absolutely one of the first things that's going to happen is a couple, especially if it's a romantic couple, they're going to pair up.
Yeah.
So there is going to be copulation that's happening, and there are going to be potential fallout effects that can come down the line. Okay, so that out of the way, to ASRI. So ASRI, and this is having been my PhD dissertation chair.
Yes, yeah.
So ASRI was developed conceptually. Wow, probably close.
When was I'm trying to remember? Was that?
So my dissertation was published. I completed my dissertation in late 2015. It was published in 2016. But ASRI was developed.
That was when you first proposed ASRI.
That was when I first proposed it. Yes.
Yeah. I remember that as your dissertation chair. Yeah. Because
I had, as you remember, I had launched into the whole sex and space topic as a dissertation topic, asking certain things that generally are asked. Can we have sex in space? What would that be like? What is reproduction like in space? And I found so many gaps in the data and so many acknowledgments by the sort of leading folks medically in the field, saying that we effectively know nothing, little to nothing of what we need to know when it comes to reproductive systems and just reproductive biology and embryogenesis.
And all these questions that started being asked in the 70s, if I remember correctly, by one of your.
So early on, when it comes to the topic of astrosexology or space sexology, study of sex in space. That first started happening. People first started raising questions in the 70s, and then biologic experiments started happening on Soviet biosats. I think the earliest one was 1979, where specifically slated to reproduction. It was Cosmos 1129, I believe, was the biosat. And they sent up 2 male rats and 5 female rats, live subjects, to observe them. And mating did occur, but they don't know if fertilization properly happened. They don't know if implantation happened, because none of the female rats became pregnant. So it indicated that there may be, and I don't know if you know anything about rats, but they tend to procreate pretty well. Yeah. So the fact that there were no offspring that came out of that particular mission was, just from the mating standpoint, was kind of a curiosity, and it indicated that, hey, there may be issues with perhaps the sperm finding its way to the egg, perhaps with that then fertilized zygote making its way properly through the female's channels and implanting in the uterine wall. So if fertilization did occur, then the fertilized embryo just effectively dissolved in the female's system. So,
sure.
So that was when certain experiments started happening. NASA did some rodent experiments, going up on the shuttles. I believe it was starting in the early and mid 90s. Did a number of them in partnership with the National Institutes of Health. Dr. April Ronk, I believe, was the primary. She was the chief researcher for most of those, if not all of them. So small experiments have happened, but there are huge, as I was saying, there were huge gaps that I was finding, and virtually nothing that had been talked about or discussed when it came to human reproduction, and certainly not just human things like human sexual response, not in any official capacity. Human sexual response, behaviors, and astronauts are very, especially back then, very kind of clean cut, specific personality type, and they're exceptionally exceptionally professional. They're known for that.
Yeah, they're not going to talk about erections or vaginal wetness or anything like that.
Well, and some astronauts have talked about it in their memoirs. And I brought this up in past talks and past interviews. So astronaut Mike Mullane wrote in his
But
memoir,
this was after
Riding
he
Rockets.
left.
Yeah, this is after he had left.
Exactly.
But he talked about the fact that on his first day going up on his first space shuttle mission, he awoke to an erection so intense that it was actually kind of painful. And they call that space Viagra, that phenomenon. So there were so many gaps though, and I realized that the reasons behind it were generally funding based, which were political, which the reasons behind that were political based, because NASA is a U.S. government agency.
Yes.
The U.S. doesn't exactly have the greatest track record when it comes to human sexual health or rights or research.
Color me surprised.
We tend to kind of follow very archaic models in the way that we look at things in the public. In the public forum and public policy decisions on people's sexual rights, and ultimately making policy decisions that would be much better for not just individuals but for society overall, typically based on some sort of religious convictions of members of Congress and things like that. And you've got folks that don't want to ever talk about sex, and view it as some this is sexologist view it as some dirty thing. What I would say to those people, they're never going to listen to this podcast, but what I would say to certain kind of more ultra conservative types that don't want to put any funding behind science like this is, do you want the Chinese to win? That's sort of.
I think just even if they're going to be true to their convictions where, life is concerned, that would be the driver for being willing to fund these kinds of research projects in space.
Yeah, and because you will ethically, you never want to use human babies as lab rats.
Exactly.
And it would be completely immoral and wrong. And again, we go back to that informed consent conversation. It is not fair for those generations to suffer any kinds of effects or to be afforded anything less than what we have been afforded here on Earth in terms of health and development, just because we were too uncomfortable to have the conversation.
Exactly.
Come on, you're an adult. You can deal with it. We can have this conversation. We can figure out what the proper pathways are to take in order to mitigate at least the worst of potential damage. And there are fixes. There are fixes.
Harm reduction. It seems a logical thing to pursue.
Yeah, logical. Yeah, it would seem logical, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly.
But we still sort of find ourselves where we are. So realizing that government can tend to, and I've worked for the government basically my entire adult life. Government can tend to move at the speed of molasses, and we are so close. We are now on the cusp of mass space tourism becoming an actual thing within, I honestly think, within the next decade, provided everything still kind of keeps going relatively smoothly. We are so close now that we needed to be researching this stuff yesterday.
Yeah.
You know, and building data sets and, you know, doing small mammal experiments and helping build out ethical guidelines so that we can continue to advance along the track, you know, eventually move on to primates and eventually establish a sort of a guardrail system where there are regions that we know are still safe, and that's the big concern, provide, you know, that are safe to reproduce in. So there's a certain level of microgravity that should be safe for us to reproduce in successfully with roughly the same success rates that we have here on Earth. How far is that line going to be from 1 Earth G, from the rate of acceleration we have here, 9.807 meters per second squared? It could be a difference of only a few percent. It could be a difference of 10, 20, 30. I don't know. Yeah. You know, we don't know these things right now.
Right.
But
that's what ASRI is attempting to do.
That's
its mission.
Yeah. So ASRI effectively was designed as a private nonprofit organization, which is supposed to study any and all things sex in space and reproduction in space. So, you know, sex isn't just reproduction. It is also behaviors, interpersonal dynamics, you know, paraphilias, and seeing how people are going to be interacting in micro societies and things like that. Because when we go and create settlements on other worlds, you know, including, you know, for argument's sake, let's say Mars, let's say 15 years from now, we have a spot there. It's not going to be a huge colony probably quite yet at that point. In fact, I think Elon Musk had talked about wanting to create a 1 million person, I think it was a 1 million person city on Mars, which is great. So, hey, you got 1 million people. 1 million people is still way less than you're going to have here on Earth. So it's a much smaller sample size.
Right.
And in terms of partners, potential partners, sexual partners, the pool is much, you know, the pond is much, much smaller. So there's going to be different folks that are different levels of attraction, and you're working with a very different kind of data set. So ASRI in concept is intended to act as a focal point for, you know, as a nonprofit research network, is supposed to act as a focal point for any and all things sex and space, for things like data collection, data archival. So anytime a paper is published or people want to draft a paper on this, you know, we can help drive resources to them. Experiments, you know, we have a desired experiment roadmap of how we think the research is going to need to go in the most efficient manner possible. Knocking out certain experiments, some of which have already been designed, by the way. You know,
I think we talked about that in the last episode. Some of the ones
that
have been designed already.
Where we want to be able to help flow funding to them, and, you know, public advocacy support. A big part of what we do is, you know, the speaking circuit and just raising public awareness about this issue. So when I was at South by Southwest, I spoke with a young woman and we were having a conversation. It was at a, you know, one of the after parties. And, you know, it was the conversation of, hey, what do you do? You know, kind of thing. I explained why I was there. And I've always, I've sort of noticed this with almost everybody I've talked to on the topic. And it happened this week at the space, just a couple of days ago at the Space Tourism Conference.
Yeah.
There's always a point where you're explaining the background of it and how little research there is. And I will never forget the look on her face, especially where you just saw her have this sudden moment of realization. And it almost looked disturbed. And she said, wait, if we can't have babies in space, how are we going to populate Mars? Yeah, you know, and it was just sort of this pause, and I just looked at her, and
it's like we're supposed to trying to be a multi-planet or multi-system species, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I just looked at her, I said, exactly.
Yeah,
So So it tends to be something that your average person doesn't think about often. Even your average, space enthusiast doesn't think about that often, other than in sort of a novel way, like, oh, that would be fun. But they
Yeah,
don't think about they don't think about the consequences very much, which again is one of the, drivers behind that green paper that Professor Cullen had helped organize, and obviously is the lion driver behind
right.
that.
Spearheaded it. Yeah, yeah.
Um, but ASRI, so we were officially founded in January of this year as a nonprofit research network. One of our key roles is to interface with universities, private organizations, agencies, as necessary. And what I would communicate to NASA, what I've said, I said it recently on another podcast, what I would communicate to them, anybody from there that is listening, is I recognize the political hurdles and the funding hurdles that you have on your plate. NASA can't, it feels sort of restrained from being able to do a lot of research in this area, certainly in a very public way.
Sure.
Because it threatens their funding, from Congress. And if NASA loses their funding, then all of this is a sort of a moot point anyway.
Right.
Also, what is ultimately going to be at the end of the rainbow? What if we find out that 0.38 Earth G, so the Mars level gravity, is not sufficient for sustaining multiple generations of the good old fashioned way of birthing human beings,
Right.
and having multiple generations go down the line.
Mm-hmm.
Because then we sort of lose Mars, if we can't safely and ethically do it, or if we just can't do it at all,
Right.
because the gravity prescription is not high enough.
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface of Mars, you can't really change that. You can try and work with centrifuges and things like that, but your day to day, you're still going to have potentially, certain levels of impact that may not be medically acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And it compounds over multiple generations. So that's another thing that you have to consider.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If we lose Mars as a destination for settlement, now what do we do?
Right.
So because in concert with that, we lose the moon as well. The moon has even lower gravity than Mars does. So suddenly we're left sort of in the wind, and where do we go next as a species? And I've talked about alternative options for us having a sort of species insurance policy by establishing human settlements out in space elsewhere, but doing things like hollowing out asteroids and creating superstructures inside of asteroids. So you just kind of have an orbital incubator, as I've called it in the past.
Right.
And that's not my idea either. So first time I heard that idea put forth was from Dr. Jim Logan, who also served on my dissertation committee, and he did a talk on it, I want to say back in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
But that is that's a viable solution. It's an engineering based solution where, yes, you're going to have to capture an asteroid, stabilize an asteroid in a certain orbit somewhere, or even do a small moon like Deimos, which is what he suggests. Deimos is the smaller moon of Mars. Hollow out the center and then create a giant rotating space colony inside of it, so that centrifugal force gives you effectively 1 Earth G of gravity.
Yeah.
And then you can create your atmosphere and your habitat, your environment inside of that cocoon, if you will. And you can still raise, theoretically, you should still be able to raise human beings all the way from, hey, embryogenesis all the way down the line to when they stop growing. And I believe that I'm not sure what it is for females, but I believe that human males don't stop ever fully growing until they reach the age of 23.
I heard it was 25, but that sounds about in
yeah. So I mean, yeah, sometimes early to mid 20s. So that's quite a stretch of time. If you want to talk about being in sort of a safe physiological environment to develop, as opposed to the Martian surface, which is not going to afford you as good of benefit, if you will. And on the Martian surface, we're going to have to be living under the ground, because the atmosphere is so thin, and so Mars, I think, has a magnetosphere, but it's very weak, and I think Mars has maybe 1% of Earth's atmosphere.
Right.
So thin that you're not afforded the same radiation protection from galactic cosmic radiation from all around the rest of the universe, and and our own sun, obviously, that you get from Earth's super thick atmosphere. So Earth's atmosphere has so much mass in it that there is a much higher chance of any radiation particles that are coming from outside that aren't caught in the Van Allen belts, is still going to have to pass through the entire atmosphere, and odds are very high that it's going to hit an air particle on the way down.
Yeah.
So we still have this protective cloak, the combination of our magnetosphere and our atmosphere, that gives us a livable radiation environment down on the surface of the Earth. It's very, very low. I think it's 300 millirem a year or something like that in most places, and then I want to say in Colorado it's like 400 millirem a year, depending on your
elevation,
your altitude.
Altitude, yeah.
So airline pilots actually have a higher exposure to radiation over the course of their lifetimes, because they're flying at 35,000 feet or
Right.
whatever altitude they're at.
Well, I also correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I understand it, testicles have a much higher rate of being affected by radiation than ovaries because of the stomach wall that protects.
Yeah, I mean,
ovaries
they
and so
are.
forth, whereas testes don't have that same level of protection.
Yeah, the male testes are, I mean, they're external to the body. So they are exposed compared to the ovaries.
Well, I would imagine that would affect sperm production.
Not
necessarily production, but the quality of the sperm itself.
I mean, theoretically, yes. There have been some sperm studies that have used bull sperm, urchin sperm that have been set up. I think they were primary testing things like motility.
Mm-hmm.
How sperm swim in, they actually swim faster in microgravity.
Mm-hmm.
The trade-off is that, yes, so the female reproductive organs are better protected in those environments because they are internal to her body. So her body provides a little bit extra shielding, as opposed to the males, but male gametogenesis is much more rapid. And obviously, so a woman is born with all her ova. And, once she reaches sexual maturity, her ova are, releasing every month. If the ova that are, I guess I would say, on deck, if your ova are heavily damaged, because of radiation, that could lead to potential sterilization. Males, if you are, it has been theorized that if males are exposed, if the testes are exposed long enough to certain levels of radiation, yes, that male could also be sterilized. As far as the individual cells, the individual sperm being damaged, we still produce a ton of them. So once you get back into sort of a safer environment or a protected environment, and your testes are still functioning, then yes, you should, in theory, still be able to produce plenty of viable sperm. And I don't know that there's ever been a study done on astronauts having children after spending significant amounts of time on.
That would be an interesting study.
Yeah, on the space station. Well, studies that I think should be out there, but I don't think they are studies like that, and studies on things like, hey, I mean, just general physiology. Hey, rates of cancer for astronauts later in life, because astronauts are technically classified as radiation workers. I mean, they're in a high enough radiation environment.
Right.
So.
Well, it sounds like ASRI has a lot on its plate.
It would. I mean, what I would say to, as I was kind of speaking to earlier, what I would say to NASA is, hey, we get it. We understand that you can't really publicly talk about this or deal with it very, very much. Certainly not, in the light, so to speak. Let us take that off your plate. I'm not even asking for your help or funding or anything like that. But yeah, let us get humanity going down this path, and get the science done, because it is crucial to humanity. If we can't figure out how to reproduce in environments other than Earth, we are basically stuck as a single planet species. And I've said this before: single planet species do not survive over an extended timeline.
Right.
We've had 5 mass extinctions here on Earth so far. We're in the middle of the 6th one,
Right.
driven by human activity.
Yep.
So these are, if we really do want to establish an existential insurance policy, not just for our species, but for other Earth species, these are questions that we need to be answering now. And we especially need to be answering them now because people that are going to go up and engage in sexual activity are not that far around the corner. I mean,
Right.
it's coming soon. And we need to know, just from an ethical standpoint, we need to know and establish some guidelines and give informed consent before we find ourselves in the situation where we need to provide that.
Right.
So ASRI is intended, again, as a focal point for any of this kind of research, and we exist to help drive the conversation, help aid the research, conduct the research ourselves, archive all of it, and hope to eventually, be able to provide labs and things like that. So, and we are partnered with, so Spaceborne United is a for-profit commercial company that focuses specifically on IVF, and we need everybody to be part of the conversation. So we don't just need reproductive biology to be.
Well, and that's the interesting part to me, of course, as a researcher doing what I do with regard to paraphilic behavior and so forth. The question that comes to my mind as someone who's on the advisory board for ASRI is well, there's a number of questions, but given this is a new environment and a new way in which people are going to be sexually active, are we going to see the development of new paraphilias? And if so, what are their origins and how can we explain them and so forth? And how's that going to affect social interactions in these environments? And so those are the questions that have been on my mind, as I've followed your work and been a part of your work and so forth as well.
Well, and I honestly
think more
think
of a weirder conversation.
no, I mean,
it's of course the mainstream conversation, but I always look into those darker parts of human psychology, and these are questions I think that need to be answered because they're important here on Earth. Why wouldn't they be important in space as well?
Well, and so I was speaking with one of the panel participants at South by Southwest. So, and I want to speak to everything you just talked about, but who is Simon Dubay, who's a one of the next up and coming space sexologists, and he was the lead author for the case for space sexology paper that was released a couple years ago. Generated a lot of media around this area, so they hit the media circuit pretty hard after that. And we're seeing that now, the same effect with this paper that we just released. So Simon said something during our panel that I found really interesting. He said, we don't obviously, he was being sarcastic. He's like, obviously we already have sexuality completely figured out on Earth. But my concern, and his background is psychology, he's a psychologist. So he said, my concern is not so much these other things over here. I'm worried about somebody snapping. I'm worried about people being 200 million miles away from Earth, and there's a very small group of individuals, and somebody snaps, and it's because of, it's because of, something that has to do with our sexual drive, because jealousy erupts, maybe 2 crew members are having a relationship, and
love triangles.
love triangles in space.
Yeah.
But you're in much more isolated, kind of dangerous situations.
Right.
It really is a frontier.
Right.
These are micro societies that we're talking about when we're talking about small crews that may be out there together for years. And it is absurd to think that people are not going to have sexual needs, urges, and take actions that they're just going to go celibate for a 5-year period.
Right.
Because these are, physiologically functioning human adults. We don't leave our sexuality behind us when we go into these environments. So he had made that statement. Yeah, I'm worried about somebody snapping. I'm worried about unknown unknowns, things that we could not have foreseen that happen in these new environments, because these environments are so sort of unknown to us. And I honestly think the question or the answer to your question is yes when it comes to, are we going to see new paraphilias develop? I would almost say absolutely, because
yeah, and that's the interesting, because there's a debate in sexology right now, is should we even call paraphilias, and do they fit the criteria of what we perceive as a paraphilia? Well,
yeah.
I would have to say that watching them develop in a completely new off Earth environment might answer some of those questions, but also raise more.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely going to find there are going to be people that they're going to learn something about themselves when they go into these environments and realize, oh, I have a microgravity, some kind of kink
I
related to
think not even just
microgravity.
like developing new ones, but in these kind of environments with so much time, well, for these existential questions, that they might discover paraphilias that they had been suppressing or hadn't wanted to acknowledge, and now
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, because the social dynamics are going to change.
right.
And I mean the model that we've always gone off of in space travel to this point has always been, hey, you've always had there's always a sponsoring agency like NASA, and even with the commercial folks, it's like these commercial crews are taking off from U.S. soil, and space law is sort of around, it's kind of built around sort of international law and maritime law and things like that, but also the laws of the country from which you may be launching from or landing back in.
Yep.
So that's always been an interesting debate on the legal side. I spoke to a friend of mine who's he's active in the in the commercial space community, as well as with space policy, and has his sort of ear to the ground on space law and its development. And he said it's a pretty congested field right now. But to my knowledge, there's not a lot of discussion around this topic, sex and space as a topic. And you're going to have new social structures in these environments where, I should finish my thought first. You've always been sponsored by agencies, and you always have a mission commander. So, hey, there's a mission commander, there's a hierarchy. Everybody has, a set of objectives, and their schedules are very closely followed, and your whole day is scheduled out as an astronaut. If you're an astronaut on the ISS, you have a schedule that somebody on the ground put together for you. You're going to be doing this from this time to this time. You're going to be conducting this experiment for these 2 hours, and then you got to go exercise, and then you got to eat, and then I don't know if they schedule like bathroom breaks and things like that. That might be tougher to predict, but they have a very rigorous, scheduled out, structured day. It's going to be different when you have regular, just regular settlers going into these new environments, and there's different social dynamics.
Well, different social dynamics, and one would imagine that it would be multicultural, so you have those playing itself out as well.
And that is something that even the last in the discussion I had at Space Tourism Conference a couple days ago, and at South by Southwest, that we discussed was there are different cultures, not just Western cultures, that are going into these environments, and hey, do those cultures clash? And they have different kind of sexual norms and traditions, things like that. So you may have a scenario where, hey, if you have a gay astronaut couple, where somebody else on the crew is 100% morally against that, and what kind of conflict does that create? Because these are, again, very small, at least initially, will be very small, very tight-knit crews over vast distances. And the crew dynamics, the interpersonal dynamics, can pose a threat to mission success. If things go bad, that can threaten the outcome of the entire mission. And that has always been raised as as a concern by by actual agency psychologists, psychologists at NASA. Crew selection is a very, very important component.
I think
Now,
this story has played itself out in like space movies for decades now.
yeah, no, yeah. There's
I mean,
there's
there's
always that.
fictional accounts, so it would make sense that these are dynamics that we have to take seriously.
Yeah, and it's not just down to selecting the individuals, making sure, hey, does this individual have anything, any latent issues, latent psychological issues that may make them snap.
I don't know that we can predict that if someone's going to another planet, say Mars, for 2 or 3 years. I think even the most psychologically stable individual is going to be under stressors that can't be predicted over those periods of time.
Yeah, and there's extreme forms of stress. The environment itself is stressful. Your sleep patterns can be profoundly affected. Circadian rhythm can be all screwed up. When you're in orbit around the Earth, sun rises every 90 minutes.
Yeah.
If you're on the ISS, so that can mess with people. But their sleep time is scheduled in.
Yeah.
For every astronaut that is up there. I think from the Jimmy Kimmel clip, I know this, like at least as of a few days ago, there were 7 astronauts that are on the ISS right now.
Yeah. Yeah. He
that's the only reason I know that
right now.
But you are under such higher levels of stress, and that's why astronauts go through the training that they do.
Yeah.
You're under much higher levels of stress when you're in those environments, and now extend that out over the course of years, which is why NASA has always been extremely selective with their process. All astronaut selection is
yes, but I don't know that that's something that kind of selection rigor.
Well, they go through a ton of psychological.
I don't know that that's possible when you're talking about settlements on other planets.
Well, when you're talking about regular people, how do we go through that selection process?
Yeah.
And especially if we're talking about settlement processes of, we want to send families, whole families. Hey, we can send. Hey, let's send couples, predetermined couples. But what happens if the couple ends up hating each other, halfway through the trip, and they want to get a divorce, but they're, it's a married couple that's up there. Oh, by the way, you think that a married couple is not going to have sex while they're traveling through interplanetary space at all? They're going to wait until they get to Mars. Like that. I mean, if they are going for settlement, that is the entire point.
Right. Well, not only that, but if you do actually manage to successfully birth children on another planet, those kinds of changes in microgravity and the environment in general could produce mental health changes that we can't predict at this point. And so it might not be the original settlers that are, present the issue. It could be the offspring.
Yeah, and there's no way, like you said, there's kind of no way that we can know that right now. The compounded effects,
especially if we're not even studying fertilization in space.
Yeah, so these are all things that we are well behind the ball on.
Right.
Now, again, like I want to give, I want to give NASA the benefit of the doubt here, in that the problem has not really quite yet presented itself. They haven't gotten there yet. They are, again, primarily about engineering vehicles, and just getting us there is their primary concern right now. So they're probably not going to take up anything that threatens the entire budget, that is going to preclude them allowing us to get to said location.
Exactly. And even Neil deGrasse Tyson made the argument that space exploration is driven by, there's a war driver.
Oh yeah. So
are we going to die? Right.
And one of the one of the kind of silver linings, I guess, of the Cold War was that it drove the space race. And society.
Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about this extensively.
Yeah, and society has seen all those great benefits that have come from development of those technologies. And I mean, we see now, hey, we have GPS satellites everywhere.
Right.
So GPS was developed as a military platform, is still a military platform. People kind of forget that sometimes. It's a military satellite system.
Yeah.
Most of the commercial world operates off of GPS now. It has massive efficiency implications for business and transport, and even just personal, navigation. So traffic, driving through oh my God, I was driving through Los Angeles this last
I'm sorry.
weekend, and it's a nightmare.
Yeah,
But
I know, I know.
can you imagine what it would be like without GPS? Because GPS is,
That's why I try to avoid Los
you
Angeles.
you can have, prediction of traffic patterns and things like that. And hey, you can expect a slowdown in this area. Otherwise, we'd have no idea what time we're predicted to arrive. So all that's, all sort of that predictive modeling is all based on GPS. If GPS were just cut off from the human race all of a sudden, it would be bedlam, my guess. Nobody would know how to get where they need to go or anything like that.
You'd be going back to paper maps. Good luck with that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Which, when was the last time paper maps were updated or,
who
published in
knows?
mass that, you'd have enough of them. So, yeah, if, as a pilot, like you still have to be able to read a paper map for that reason. If you lose your systems, almost entirely, you're going to be navigating, clock to map to ground kind of old school. So NASA, NASA can't really be expected right now to have to deal with this scenario. It's really just sort of a thorn in their side whenever they're asked about this. ASRI and its partner organizations, our purpose for existence is to hopefully help take that off their plate. Because the science still needs to be done, this discussion still needs to be had, and it needs to be had by people much smarter than me. I mean, we need, like I said, everybody. It's sort of an all hands on deck scenario at this point. Things are progressing so rapidly in the commercial sector that we are going to be faced with the scenarios earlier than we had anticipated, and all the research still needs to be done. So if you are a psychologist or anthropologist or folks out there, please feel free to reach out. We're at asri.space, asri.space, which I guess we'll put a link in the
I'll put a link in the description.
Or potentially an associate researcher, you have an idea for a paper, please hit us up. Or hey, we have ideas for papers that we need co-authors on and things like that. So as long as the conversation is driving forward, that's what I really care about. We need momentum behind the research, and hey, and also funding. If you want to help contribute to humanity getting off of Earth and establishing an existential insurance policy and making sure that humanity survives in the long term, this is sort of a key component of that research in this area. And again, ASRI, we're sort of a comprehensive all of the above thing when it comes to, human sexuality and reproduction. And then, we have more sort of focused partners, like Spaceborne in the IVF area, for example. So as long as things continue to progress, that is what we ultimately care about. That the research is getting done and that it is getting done in such a manner that it is available to all of humanity. As opposed to, folks that may be doing, or nations, for example, that may be doing research but have no intent of sharing that with the rest of humanity because they're looking to get a leg up on everybody else. So I won't call anybody out specifically here, but it's like I don't want an authoritarian government to have the keys to the universe, as I've called them before, which is the data sets and findings that allow you to safely navigate these straits and have human offspring in space environments and be able to successfully settle other planets before, say, maybe a more Western style liberalized democracy has access to that and, shares that with for the benefit of the entire species.
I think that is, well, obviously I'm participating in it. It's a worthwhile goal that has long-term, not just galactic implications, but like you said, existential ones. So I think that's a really good note to wrap up on, because we've gone probably about an hour and 20 minutes now. And I know that we've covered a fraction of the implications and the various ways in which this research could impact humanity generations down the road. So But we're just going to keep talking about this, and hopefully, even if it's comedians on their late night show joking about it, it gets
No, I mean, like
yeah,
at
it
this
gets
point,
the
no
attention of
no
people
no
to at
press is
least
bad
think
press.
about it, right?
Yeah,
At
as
least think
long as exposure is happening and people are asking the questions, we want the conversation to be had.
yeah.
So, and comedians are great communicators in general. I spoke with a young comedian who had watched our panel at South by Southwest, and he actually came up and asked us a question about it afterward. He said, where do you see comedians fitting into this conversation?" And my answer to him was verbatim. I said, absolutely indispensable.
Yeah,
And then I
absolutely.
went on to, talk about, hey, you guys are some of the best communicators out there, and you can do it in a way where you bring light and laughter to topics
Very
that
heavy
are
topic.
difficult to talk about.
Yes.
Some of the best, cathartic discussion that has ever been had on some of the darkest topics out there are had by comedians, and they
Yeah.
do it in a way that I'll use I'll use cathartic again, in a way that is helpful, and it helps heal in certain areas, and it helps you talk about things that need to be talked about that are difficult.
Well, I think not just comedians, but science communicators as well.
Yeah, good science communicators.
Good science communicators, which are rare but incredibly important too. Exploring these, you and I tend to delve into the heavy topics, but those that can actually, like someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson and like Jimmy Kimmel or what have you, like who can talk about these things in ways that inspire and that create laughter and so forth. That way we can touch on these topics and not be so dragged down by them.
Yeah.
All of that matters. All of that matters. And I'm sure the conversation is going to continue. So on that note, thank you so much, Dr. Layendecker, Alex, for joining me today. I know we still have all kinds of things to talk about, but I really wanted to get your thoughts on all of the recent attention that this topic has been getting. And then, of course, we can follow up when other things happen, especially with what's going on potentially in Iceland and so forth. So with that, I'm going to wrap up for today, and we'll follow up with you at some point in the future when more things develop.
Awesome. Thanks, Fee. Always a pleasure.